Thank you so much, Volker, for the invitation to come and speak in this very impressive series and also for the generous introduction. I am going to go ahead and share my screen now. Yes, and now I'm going to, there we go. And now, yes, we are in yes, presentation mode, I think. So I'm going to start the presentation and Mikko is going to come in a little bit towards the middle. So let me just introduce what we're talking about today. So along with our colleague Alex, who isn't able to be with us here today, we are interested in this question of how platform cooperatives can contribute to bringing the sharing economy back towards its roots in wanting to have pro-social outcomes. And what some of the possibilities for that might be. I know that there's lots of interesting research on platform cooperatives happening at TU Berlin, and also I'm sure amongst the rest of you here today, the perspective that we can bring, which is perhaps a little bit different to this, is that we take a consumer perspective. So in other words, from the consumer side, how are platform co-ops viewed, interpreted, used? What meaning do they bring? And so I think that that part of answering the question is something really important to bring into this larger conversation about the sharing economy and platform cooperatives in general. So let's get started. I think it's safe to say, and hopefully you all agree at this point, which is about 12 or 13 years after the sharing economy first started, that while it's been very innovative in terms of business models, it's revolutionized the way we travel, where we stay, what we wear. To a large extent, it has been under-delivering on social benefits. So what I'm referring to here is things like, the research that is thought that when ride sharing first started, it was going to replace people having, owning single one car per person or one car per family. But actually what ride sharing has replaced is public transportation usage. So these are the types of relationships that I'm referring to. So we're, the book that's referred to here, the Schor 2021, is After the Gig, what happened to the sharing economy and can we bring it back? So this argument is, similar, parallel to the one that she makes, which is that all of the kind of utopian discourses surrounding how we're all going to, have an increased sense of community, we're going to lower our carbon footprints. Is there any way to actually, that the sharing economy could deliver on these initial promises? So what we're interested in is that, can we reimagine marketing strategy in the sharing economy with a view of eliciting new ways in which the sharing economy can offer responsible, respectful, and resilient solutions in today's market? So the reference here, De Ruyter et al. 2021, is in the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Sciences, and this is an article which says we as researchers need to be thinking about the grand challenges that exist and positioning our research around how we can try and address them, perhaps with a little more urgency than we have in the past, given the nature of climate change, etc. So we're interested in trying to come up with some ideas and solutions stemming from this background. So there are a lot of sustainability claims in the sharing economy, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. And what happens is because the outcomes, as I mentioned before, even if you access clothing rather than buy it through different platforms such as buy rotation, it's not necessarily clear that you've lowered your carbon footprint by not purchasing clothes, given all the dry cleaning that goes in every time you send back something that you wear, given the fact that you are mailing these clothes all over the country. In particular, in the US, for example, it's a very large, it's a very large space, which takes up a lot of carbon footprint. So there ends up being a tension between kind of the lived experience for sustainably oriented green consumers and the sustainability claims that are often used in this space. So recent research has begun to unpack some of these tensions between the sustainability claims and the unsustainability of it. This Beverland et al. Citation is in the Journal of Macro Marketing. suggesting that despite the desire to emphasize these kind of non-commercial motives, that because sharing platforms remain underpinned by traditional market logics, there's really no way for them to actually deliver on this. So what this suggests is that there is, a new form of delivery, a new form of logics need to come into play. So what we're interested in is, can platform cooperatives be this new model and provide this? So let's see. As I said, I know a lot of you, in particular at TU Berlin, have been working in this area, so I think you're quite familiar with what platform cooperatives are. But what we've outlined here is the particular definition that we are using, which comes from Schultz. And so here it's platform cooperatives have three characteristics. It's replicating existing technology from commercial platforms with a cooperative ownership model. I think the important thing about this component of the definition is that it's not necessarily about innovating in terms of how a platform works, but rather where the point of differentiation is at the ownership model level. So secondly, embedding solidarity within the business model. So what this means is making sure that kind of the profits aren't extracted by one particular stakeholder, but that the model is set up so that they are a bit more equitable across different stakeholders. And then finally, reframing innovation and efficiency with the goal of benefits for all. So some examples of platform cooperatives that have been quite successful so far. We have Stocksy, which Juliet Schor has done some great analyses of why this platform cooperative has been so successful. For those of you who may not know it, they provide stock photography and have set up a model for the photographers who provide the photos that is much more equitable than a lot of the competitors. AirBnB in Italy, which is, as you can guess by the name, very similar to Airbnb, but has a focus on at the community level on bringing benefits to the communities. Radish in Canada, which is a restaurant delivery platform similar to Grubhub or Just Eats or Deliveroo. And then finally, Drivers Co-op, which is in New York City, and it is a ride-sharing platform very similar to Uber. Mikko will introduce this a little bit later, but the two that we study in this study are Airbnb and Drivers Co-op. Okay, so the primary differentiation for platform co-ops is essentially the ideological discourse. So as I mentioned before, it's not necessarily that by choosing, say, Drivers Co-op over Uber, you're getting any type of functional benefits, but you are able to participate in an ideological discourse and a program which is perhaps more aligned with your personal values from the consumer standpoint. So platform co-ops tend to be, are mission-driven. They deploy various ideological narratives, and essentially from a consumer perspective, what they hope to do anyway is they provide guilt-free choice. So in other words, trust me, we have so many people that we interviewed within this study who are like, oh, I really hate Uber and every single thing it stands for, but it's so convenient. So they still choose it anyway, but there's a lot of guilt surrounding it. And the idea behind platform co-ops are, we're providing the same thing, but it's a guilt-free choice because you know that you're not exploiting you're not contributing towards the exploitation of the driver who's driving you by virtue of getting this convenient benefit that you want. So far, in terms of the research that's been done on platform co-ops, which, by the way, you'll notice that most of the citations are from 2021 onward. It's quite new. Well, 2020 onward, I would say. It's quite new in terms of the analyses that have appeared in the literature so far. But so far, it's kind of clear that from a worker perspective, there are definite benefits that they will, in comparison to workers who are on the more traditional platforms, the kind of, the Ubers, the Deliveroos, et cetera, that there is more equity, equality, it's more fair, and that different kinds of discrimination, which have been recognized on other platforms, tend to be less in platform co-ops. But there is a lot that is still unknown, and I would highlight that this is from a couple different areas. So the first is they haven't been as successful as even Juliet Schor, her book from 2020, kind of presents platform co-ops as the silver bullet, the answer to all of the sharing economy's woes. And I think it's kind of clear that this hasn't necessarily been the case. So these three citations you see at the bottom here are just some examples of which have pointed out why platform co-ops haven't performed as well in the market as a lot of people hoped they would have. The primary reason is lack of capital. So lack of investment, and in particular from venture capital investors, lack of government supports, high operational costs, which typically ends up resulting in high end user prices. So from a consumer point of view, one thing that we really know from the consumer ethics literature is that while consumers really want to support causes that and values that align with themselves, they're really not willing to pay more to do that, or to compromise kind of any element of convenience or satisfaction in any way to do so. So if there are higher prices, for example, that's automatically going to eliminate, the amount of people that would be needed for a platform to get to scale. So the conclusion from this is that much is unknown about the critical factors of success for platform cooperatives. So we're interested in contributing to this understanding and this discourse from the perspective of the consumer, as I mentioned before. So our research question then is, how can platform cooperatives contribute to reimagining the sharing economy? I guess I would add as a caveat to that, if at all. And as Mikko will explain in a minute, when we talk about our methodology, we approach this from a consumer point of view and also from a qualitative point of view, in line with our disciplinary backgrounds and our methodological orientations. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Mikko to tell you a little bit about our methodology and findings, and then I'll come back at the end of the talk to introduce and talk through our theoretical contributions a little bit more. Mikko, please go ahead.
Thank you, Giana. So Giana was highlighting what we're doing in terms of the overall approach to our study, is that we're looking into these spaces, these kinds of third spaces between the platform cooperatives and the dominant sharing economy platforms as a solution. I'll come to that in a minute. What we do methodologically is we've decided, first of all, to study two platforms in particular. We're focusing on two platform cooperatives that provide a differentiated solution in relation to the mainstream platforms. We are focusing on AirBnB and the Drivers Co-op, that are both cooperative responses to Airbnb and Uber, respectively, and have been successful in creating at least the kind of initial interest in these platforms already seen from the perspective of the media interest that they have created. So AirBnB works differently from Airbnb in that it connects to the local communities. It supports local projects through its model that addresses extractive tourism and unfair impacts to neighborhoods. Airbnb directs half of the commissions that come from flat rentals to local projects. Thereby, it's embedding its actions into the local communities. The Drivers Co-op, on the other hand, offers fairer pay to drivers who join to drive for the platform. So its model is a simple focus on the returns to the drivers. What we have done data collection wise is that we've first done ethnographies as to understand the phenomenon, what we're talking about in relation to platform cooperatives, and also finding those best examples that we then decided is our Airbnb and Drivers Co-op focus. We've also been and still are conducting in-depth interviews with consumers and providers who offer flats and rides on these platforms, as well as investors and platform managers. And we're finally moving into the community coordination of local activities as well. And then we use our own experiences while we're collecting these data in a way of collecting and forming insight in an autoethnographic manner. What we're trying to do really is to find those success factors that Giana was mentioning, or whether there are limitations to the platforms. And we have come to certain key findings to date, which relate to the way in which those platform cooperatives cannot perhaps challenge the dominant forms of the sharing economy head-on, but how platform cooperatives could still engender a new kind of a sharing economy. And these come down to those functional, structural, ideological, and decentralizing or decentralization-oriented activities. And really, these have to do with, on a functional level, on how platforms work, on the structural level, on how the markets in which they compete are structured. That is, what is the sort of competition context? Then the ideological narratives address how we use communications, discourses, and stories to position the platforms vis-a-vis the mainstream players. And finally, what is emerging in our data right now is the idea of decentralization. This as a way of turning both those functional and structural issues that clearly hinder platform cooperatives to a different competitive approach that may allow to challenge and change the sharing economy in the larger sense. And I think that's the most interesting avenue that we're now finding emerging from our data as we're moving along with our data collection. Moving on, next we want to give you some illustrations of what we talk about in relation to these dimensions, the competitive dynamics, the pros and cons or limitations and opportunities that they can provide for platform cooperatives in the sharing economy market space. So first of all, starting on the functional level, participants seek functional benefits. They seek easiness of use and how the platform can conveniently match their needs and the offerings. This is one of the main reasons why the sharing economy could successfully challenge traditional industries such as taxis and hotels in the first place. And this is something that Kevin here reflects. In this space, the platform cooperatives have introduced a level of interest, particularly to the providers who, unlike tourists, stay in their local environments. This applies to both ride sharing and flat sharing. So these providing participants are eager to support alternative models on the level of the idea, but there are also pain points which are clearly connected to the fact that there are functionality issues such as the responsiveness of host or ride providers as seen from the perspective of the consumers. We have found that the initial versions of the platforms and the apps, if the apps even exist, have not provided a well-functioning functional benefits. They have not been working and people have not been able to gain access to the offerings or secure the transaction depending on whether they're providers or consumers. For example, Henry here, joining the AirBnB platform, says that if there is no choice, there is no offering on the platform, there will also be no consumer interest on the offering either. So moving on to the next slide, as Giana presented before, replication of the existing models has been seen as a way in which, on the basic level, platform cooperatives could challenge the mainstream platforms. But clearly from our results, that's not happening at the moment. And the replication is in fact a challenge for the platforms. Successful replication is not showing in the interview insights. From the flat sharing providers' perspective, for example, there is limited relevant functionalities. There isn't offering enough on the platform, which also then restricts the way in which the platform can grow. This kind of, say, earnings issues through functionality are combined with limited awareness in the consumer base. And this has led to certain limits to growth, certain limits to scaling up. On the platform level overall, differentiation limits further brand equity building and how that can happen in this competitive space. This is sort of the functional side of the story. As our interviewees illustrate, there are several functional issues for the platform participants and the platform managers. They are also aware of these issues. Now on the next slide, structurally, it's a similar story with limitations. There's a clear connection between the functional and the structural challenges that platform cooperatives have. The main structural limitations come from the disconnect between the platform cooperative model, the business model, its access to funding, and the understanding from those who typically invest in these kinds of projects, that is venture capitalists. On the structural level, not only the venture capitalist, the limited venture capitalist investment, but also the fact that cooperatives cannot really exploit their workforce, which is still common practice in traditional platform economy or the gig economy, is really structuring and limiting the possibilities of platform cooperatives. This is leading to the fact that they cannot, platform cooperatives really cannot head-to-head compete with the existing providers. As some of our informants here are saying, platform cooperatives, if they try to compete in this space, they're going to be challenged. They do not have the marketing power to compete one-on-one. They don't have that venture capitalist financing. They don't have enough people. They don't have enough of the resources to do this. On the other hand, there is such a heavy competition in this industry, and given this kind of structural exploitation, particularly those of the providers, of the sharer side, if you will, the providers, but also the consumers move quite fluidly between these different platforms to make their ends meet. So as Richard here is saying, most of the drivers who drive for Uber and who drive for Lyft, they are on several platforms. They are on all the platforms available at all times. So going back to why, from the consumer's perspective, the functionality is not working, we can clearly see that structurally already, because the providers are on all spaces at all times, of course, they won't be responding necessarily to the consumers when they need them on one platform. So platform providers are trying to maximize their gains, but that's only one side of the story. Moving to the next slide. So we can see that the structural and functional limitations are well connected. But what about the ideological? Because the ideological framing really is a way in which platform cooperatives can potentially reimagine or even help reimagine the sharing economy overall. Recently, due to the fact that the mainstream providers are becoming more and more restricted in the way in which they can operate, because they are regulated in their operations, they have started to reposition themselves. And there's a lot of narratives that come around this. These mainstream platforms have initiatives that they've started to address their impacts on their stakeholders, to their impacts on the society. But still, the consumers and the providers that we have interviewed are basically saying that this is not believable. This is just marketing talk. So even if they see that Uber could be a solution to big challenges, it could be providing us with ways of addressing environmental issues, sharing rights rather than owning, they still see these kinds of pro-social projects as a way of just greenwashing, as marketing talk, as a sort of a smoke screens that the platforms are using. Carol and Samantha here are both saying that there is nothing good about this. So if you want to change the world, why not pay your workers better? If you want to be pro-social, try to address the problems that are happening in the local communities where you establish high demand on tourism, experience before the local impact, or are extracting value from those very locations. So what we can see here is that the ideological repositioning is not working, and this is going to the next slide, please. And here we see that the benefits that platform cooperatives can have in their ideological narratives. So platform cooperatives, they do not only have the basic cooperative structure, they draw on the ideas of profit sharing, resource pooling, and practices of democratic decision making that allow them to work democratically for all of the participants' benefits. But beyond this, they also engage in building narratives of authenticity that reflect actual benefits to their members, actual benefits to people who engage on the platforms who are not necessarily members or owners, and increasingly to a wider network of stakeholders. So as we can see from Grace here, she's saying that community-powered tourism is a way for them to create an authentic narrative, to create authentic impact in the communities that they work. The benefit here is clearly that on the grassroots level, say in a neighborhood or in a city, the platform cooperative can be much more believable than their mainstream competitors. Moving on to the next slide, there is a caveat here though, and that relates to the way in which the platform cooperatives mobilize and bring new kinds of democratic models into the sharing economy. So we have seen from previous research, and Giana pointed this out already, that the focus has really been previously on what are the impacts of the platform cooperative to the workers, to the working conditions. Now we've seen also that there is a lot of talk about the community, what is the impact to those who work with us in and around the communities. And the point that critically our participants are bringing up is, even with this ideological structuring, how do we deal with the fact that the actual business savvy is needed to challenge something that happens on this marketplace? So how do we grow a business? How do we actually become to challenge the dominant sharing economy platforms while attending to the ideological structuring? And so something that is appearing in our data is that you have to balance the two, the ideological with the business, and the business savvy and the business skills. And even the platform managers themselves are sometimes questioning whether or not the current business model is a sort of an intermediary model that we're doing here and the now, or is it potentially also something that needs to be more community driven, their activities be given more into the community, something that they're not currently doing. And how do you make sure that the business skill and the leadership and the kind of savvy is going to be there to maintain the functions of the platform? And this is something that reminds me of the kinds of discourses that are happening in the alternative economy spaces that I've also been studying. And the questions are really, are the alternative economies a way to a new and more sustainable future? Or are they already the more sustainable futures themselves? And in case, so we're looking at communalities here, maybe the platform cooperatives are not going to be directly to the solution unless they are going to be successful, because they're also playing in this highly competitive space. And on this next slide, this leads us to the idea of decentralization, which we find very interesting and that we have been developing further. So how can platform cooperatives actually compete with the commercial platforms, with the traditional ones, the leading ones, the venture capitalist financed ones, which work on the idea of monopolization? And this idea of monopolization has been criticized throughout the sharing economy literature, basically for a decade now, early on as these ideas started developing, because it started to look like that the solutions that are coming up are leading to monopolization. And it leads also to the realization that the sharing economy is not actually doing anything good. It's not providing benefits. What we are creating is a winner-takes-all business model, and we can clearly say that even with window dressing, social ideas, pro-social focuses, even environmental focuses, there is still going to be an approach that one actor is trying to dominate all of the others, drive them out of business, become the monopoly on the market. And for the platform cooperatives, though, we can see that when they intervene the market, when they disrupt the market, if you like, they can use these tactics of what we call decentralization. So from our data, what is emerging are three ways of doing this decentralizing. First of all, the way in which to destabilize the current business or the competitive environment is not to go for the one-to-one, but go for the one-to-many. So as we've pointed out with the structural challenges that the platform cooperatives have, they do not have the capital investment to actually do the same things as the venture capitalist financed platforms can do. So what you could do instead is to seek larger contracts. With this, you are talking about preferred business partners, business organizations. You could try to do this with municipalities, with governmental organizations, with non-profit organizations. So this is one way of creating scale without going into the head-to-head competition with the mainstream platforms, going for the one sale each time. On the other hand, and this is actually happening in practice, we're learning this from our informants, is that we could use institutional avenues, collaborating with cities, collaborating with municipalities, collaborating with the localities in which these cooperatives are working in. This is already done by aligning strategies and sharing strengths and resources, drawing on the strengths and resources from the municipalities as they relate to, for instance, marketing of the offering and marketing of the platform. So these are really ways of seeking scale through institutions. Now, finally, and what we suggest as the third kind, although please bear in mind that these different kinds of decentralization mechanisms, they work potentially similarly. There are still differences. So the first one really is about seeking bigger contracts. The second one is working through institutions. And the final one is partnering with smaller players in the market who clearly share same kinds of values, who clearly focus on challenging the market space. So bundling these together and growing the co-op in this kind of multi-stakeholder collaboration, multi-stakeholder partnering, or even multi-stakeholder membership, providing a solution that can challenge the practices of the larger players. And this leads me to giving the floor to Giana, for the final discussion on how and whether the platform cooperatives, if they are losing the battle, can they still win overall? So Giana, to you.
Thank you, Mikko. So yes, I'm going to summarize a little bit the takeaways that we hope that we hope come out of our presentation. So in contrast to previous literature on platform cooperativism, we're suggesting that it's not a silver bullet. So we're perhaps being a little more critical than what we've seen so far. So though platform cooperatives can sometimes compete with commercial platforms, and Philip et al. Have talked about some of the ways in which that could happen, we would like to suggest that there is going to be limited success in replication of this one-to-one model. So in other words, they are really never going to be able to compete with the kind of entrenched, traditional, in many cases, monopolistic players. So this one-to-many model, which Mikko was highlighting from our data, we think that it's quite promising in this space. So in other words, if you get an organization, say it's a government organization, the city of Boston, or say it's a commercial organization like Google, to contract with someone like Drivers Co-op and to say, our employees can use their accounts, in order to use your service. This is how something like Drivers Co-op is going to be able to scale up, not by competing directly. And a lot of the platform cooperative literature has focused so far on exactly how they can compete directly, but we would like to suggest that maybe that this other way, this one-to-many model, is perhaps more fruitful, thinking about ways to move forward in the future. And also, as Mikko mentioned from our data, AirBnB, for example, is in talks with Barcelona. So the city of Barcelona has very much restricted, if not outright banned, Airbnb from existing in their city because the locals can't find, there's not enough housing for locals to live. Airbnb is in talks with them to see if the city will allow them to operate. So this idea that, from an institutional perspective, where the bigger players who may not have this ideological, equitable, kind of foundation to their platform, that's going to open up particular avenues for them that aren't going to be open to the big players. So we see these ways as, ways in which the platform cooperatives can really try and focus. The second thing we'd like to suggest, and how we'd like to extend the literature, is talking about platform cooperatives as a catalyst for indirect change. And what we mean by this, and in particular with the Drivers Co-op, this came through quite strongly in our data, that the Drivers Co-op does not think they're going to put Uber and Lyft out of business. And that's really not what they're striving to do. But if they can get enough drivers who also drive for Uber and Lyft, who start driving more for Drivers Co-op because they're getting enough rides through Drivers Co-op and they get paid so much more and have so much better conditions at Drivers Co-op, then those drivers are going to begin to say to Uber and Lyft, hey, if you don't give us these same conditions, we're not going to continue to drive for you and we're going to switch completely over there. And so the change that can happen in the large players, in the incumbent players, can come through this indirect change. So in other words, how drivers co-op can be successful, if we think about, how to measure their success, is by how much they can get Uber and Lyft, for example, to actually change their own practices via these, kind of more indirect channels through the drivers. So yes, so these are kind of I think some of the key takeaways that we would like to suggest. So disrupting the competitive landscape, not by directly overtaking the leading platforms, but by offering alternate ideologies that expose the leading platform limitations from the inside out. And so what we're in the process of doing now is, putting together a strategic model from our findings for change from the margins, where challenger entrants such as platform cooperatives can shift the sharing economy from a peripheral position using some of these one-to-many institutional avenues that Mikko highlighted in our data. And then the final point here, I guess, is that, the ideology is really an important part here. And the reason why consumers want to engage with platform cooperatives is because it allows them to resolve these conflicts between their lived experience and the ideological orientation that they want to have. So some questions that also emerge from this, which I think are interesting to discuss, and we would love to hear your thoughts on these, is, we identified at the beginning, and a lot of other literature has as well, on platform cooperatives, that the lack of investment, in particular from venture capitalists, is really one of the main things that's holding them back, in particular in terms of this one-to-one competition. How can we transform investor expectations about platform cooperatives? So in other words, as I was suggesting before, maybe a measure of success is how much the incumbents change in response to the ideology and the practices of the platform cooperatives. How do we get kind of investors on board with these types of outcomes, in particular as there are more and more investment funds that are devoted specifically to pro-social outcomes? How can platform cooperatives engage questions of race and community dynamics more in their operational structures and ideological narratives? This question comes out of our data. I suspect we're not going to be able to analyze this in our own data set for this paper because we're trying to keep our focus, fairly narrow. But it was these are some things that consumers are really thinking about and want to see more innovation in this area. And then finally, how to measure the success in relation of platform cooperatives. And so what we're kind of suggesting, and again, this probably isn't our expertise as qualitative researchers, but coming up with new forms of measurement where for us as researchers, but also for the players in these fields to think about whether we can ascertain, whether success has been achieved or not, because that's what that looks like is going to be much different in comparison to the big players. So thank you so much, and we are really looking forward to hearing your comments and answering your questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other and hopefully have a lively conversation. Thank you.